Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the day the world almost ended, but first I need to get this out of the way. So this is an age-restricted video, and it's adult 18 plus only. If you're not an adult, get off of it. YouTube makes me do that. Okay, so I want to talk about the day the world almost ended. Now, a lot of people think that was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and here's the blown-up YouTube video from the spy plane where they saw the missiles being assembled in Cuba, and here was the effective estimated range. It just got into DC, and then I have several copies of paperwork. I'll slowly move this down so you can bring it up. These are all online if you really want to look them up, but these are copies that I got. And this wasn't the first flare-up. You got to remember, during the Berlin airlift, the Russians tried to stop us from, they tried to cut us off from Berlin, and so the Berlin airlift happened, and we put our foot down there. So then they tried to sneak this stuff in with Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So everybody thinks that's the closest the world's ever come to the end. And here's a State Department document. And here's the Russian document where they're talking about it. And here are a couple little pamphlets about how the danger of hydrogen bombs and whatnot. And they handed these out to you in the Army. And here's a German version of it in German. And here's a picture of the it's a facsimile copy of when the Russians when the Soviets rolled into Czechoslovakia to squash rebellion. And here's a standard setup of the wall in Berlin between there would be a no man's land, and there would be your no man's land and their no man's land. So this would be the standard in Berlin itself. Now along the edges there wasn't anything, so you could just drive over. When I was over there, you could drive over and further out in the sticks, and there wasn't hardly anybody even guarding it. But I want to go back to, so everybody thinks that this Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world ever got to ending. But I'm going to bring up a story that hardly anybody knows about. So when Reagan took office, he decided we're gonna juice up the military. We're gonna stop Soviet communist aggression, because they're all a bunch of, well, you know what communists are, they're useless. So anyway, he started an arms buildup. He started Star Wars, and so the deep military minds in Russia decided it was time to strike. They said, before we lose our numerical superiority in nuclear weapons over the U.S., which they had at the time, it was about 6%, that they were going to do a first strike. So the first strike, you've got about, when you launch your missiles and they're coming up, we read them and we launch ours. There's about approximately an 18-minute window where you can get yours off. And then both sides, it was called mutually assured destruction. That was the doctrine. If you launch, the other side would launch, and everybody would lose. Mutual assured destruction, mad. But the Russians, because they were incompetent communists, they could only get about 35% of their ICBMs online at any one time. And as you're bringing everything up online, you're filling them up with rocket fuel and liquid oxygen, and it's leaking out, and our spy planes were seeing it. We still had U-2, we had, I believe the SR-71 was also into play at the time. And so we were seeing them bringing themselves up to strike. So we started adding, we always had, Strategic Air Command always had at least 3 B-52s up going around Canada, just ready to go into Russia when the candle went up. So we started adding more up there, and we started bringing our forces up. Well, we were much more organized than the Russians. And so they couldn't ever get more than 35% of their missiles ready to go at any one time. So here are the numbers and why they pulled back. It was standard. They kept it at 89%. We could get 89% up if we had about a 5-minute warning, and the 5-minute warning was missiles in the air. We could have gotten 89% of ours up. The Russians, like I said, they couldn't coordinate, and through just lack of planning and everything else, they could only get 35% up. Well, there's also some other problems. So you have to figure in on these complicated systems, you're going to have some mechanical problems. So they figured in 2%. They also figured in their accuracy was, they never tested theirs as much as ours. We also took off from accuracy, and they figured that into their equation too. So, but the real wild card was the Star Wars. So we had anti-ballistic missiles and some other ways to take down ICBMs. They didn't know, they guesstimated it was somewhere between 2 and 6% that the new Star Wars would have taken out. So that brought their load probably that they could land of their total punch somewhere between 29 and 23%, where the US was pretty steady at 88%. Even with a slight numerical advantage, you had more than 2-to-1 advantage. The US would have won but lost. I mean, the whole world would have lost, but we would have won over a pile of mostly ashes. But anyway, that's the day that the Earth actually almost ended. It wasn't with the coronavirus, and it wasn't the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was that day in the 80s when the Russians, the Soviet Union, the communist scum decided they were going to start World War III. And the mutually assured destruction, MAD, would have taken care of it, but because of their incompetency and Reagan's buildup, that the end of the world was averted, and that's the closest we ever came to the end of the world. Thank you. I'm out.